Hey everyone, welcome to the Career Journey podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Avila. So today's episode is super exciting for multiple reasons. The first being it features one of my friends from my grad school days, Melissa O'Brien. The second reason being it's my first interview with two people at the same time. So it also includes her cousin and business partner, Dr. Holly Sachs. And third, we just went into an amazing discussion all about how to find the right grad school fit, the right fit for a career, but also really cool things about just university and academia, like how to find financial aid, how to find money, how to seek out whether or not a program will pay for you, what a good salary is depending on where you live, how to start a business. Dr. Holly Sachs even started her own business while still in high school, so she offers tons of advice. They talk about not being satisfied with your career. Melissa talks about being unemployed for about 5 months. There's just a ton of really good information in here. If you're just starting out or if you're considering going to graduate school or even undergraduate, how to find all of these resources. And the cool thing about both of them is they're starting this business called Flourishing Professional, and you can find it at flourishingprofessional.com or check our social media for the link. And this is a website, a business, outreach on how to find these resources, how to figure out what career you need to go into, how to navigate the university process from anywhere from undergraduate to graduate school. They'll help you find money. They'll help you figure out what path you need to be on and all of that. So this was just a great conversation for a lot of students out there, a lot of early career professionals that have tons of questions, or anybody starting their own business because they are in knee deep in this process right now as they're about to start launching Flourishing Professional. So without further ado, please enjoy Melissa O'Brien and Dr. Holly Sachs. Hey everyone, welcome to the Career Journey podcast, where we explore exciting careers and how to get them from the people who've lived it. I'm your host, Dr. Brittany Avila. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy. You guys are actually my first double interview.
You can edit this out, but yeah, I was joking with her beforehand. We should ask if we're your first threesome.
You are my first threesome. You are. So since it's kind of a stories personal for each of you in the beginning, obviously once it interweaves, it'll get a little easier, but it should be interesting to kind of navigate your two stories at the same time.
And they're so different too, so that's what makes it interesting.
Oh, that's exactly what I love. This is the whole point of this podcast, is the differences. All right, so let's get started then. So welcome Melissa O'Brien and Dr. Holly Sachs to the podcast. Sorry, I do a weird wave. I don't know why. Nobody's going to see it.
I can wave back. That's fine. Hello.
So we like to start the podcast with what you wanted to be as a child, because we like to kind of take it from the beginning all the way to where you're at now. So, I'm going to start with Melissa because she's on top of my screen. So what did you want to be when you were a child?
So I had a little bit of the shiny object syndrome as a kid. My dad is a cardiologist. He's a doctor. And I used to love going to work with him. And so I started off at one point saying, I'm going to be a doctor like him. In fact, actually, I think I was 7 or 8 years old. I took one of the books off of the shelf in his office and started reading through the labels for the different waves on an EKG. And I remember being at his office one day and walking into the room and actually looking at the screen to him going, that's good, that's not good. And of course, somebody's in the room. He's like, okay, time to go. And sort of scoots me out the door. But I think as I got sort of started growing up a little bit more, teenage years, I started getting really interested in law enforcement and psychology and sort of this idea of criminal profiling.
Most students.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Everybody says Criminal Minds, but I actually didn't watch that show. I watched Law & Order, and Burn Notice is still one of my favorite TV shows.
I loved that show.
Yeah. It's a good show. And so I was like, okay, this is what I'll do then. At one point, I even considered joining the military because my mom's side is military was a big deal. And I had a friend who said to me that was like 17 years old at the time. He's like, you will absolutely get kicked out of the military. I was like, why do you say that? You hate being told what to do. It will not go over well. So yeah, I did not do that. I think my parents were probably happy. I don't even know if I had really discussed it with them much at that point. But I was like, okay, I am going to study psychology and criminology in college. So I got to Penn State and I was all set on those two majors. And during my time there, I actually found myself getting more involved in some of their student conduct stuff, which is like sort of the discipline side, but it's more than that. It's some of that coaching with students who are having a little more trouble, providing some of those behavior interventions. And so I started getting involved in that. I was involved with some of the sexual misconduct awareness activities like happening on campus. So this was in 2011, right after that Dear Colleague letter came out, right when things started popping up more in the news about Title IX on college campuses, which is that basically it's 37 words long that basically says that universities have an obligation to prevent and respond to sex discrimination. Really summing that up short here. And so I got really involved with that. And I met my now husband in a research lab there where we developed an educational toolkit for educators for the classroom. And it went through like different mini presentations on how to approach topics around communication and healthy relationships and other sort of sexual misconduct issues. And I was like, okay, I can do this. I am going to work in student affairs for the rest of my life. And I discovered I could get a master's in that. I was like, I am going to do this. And so I ended up going for my master's at the University of Mississippi, where my husband boyfriend at the time already was, and where I met Brittany. So that was exciting. And I was thinking at the time as like, this is what I'm going to do. This is like, absolutely, I'm so sure of it, what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And then if you fast forward to a couple of years ago, I realized that was not what I was going to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah. What made you realize that?
So there were a few things that had happened. One of them was sort of realizing that my goals had changed. I went from sort of this focus on my individual career journey and where I wanted to be to sort of thinking ahead of, okay, who's the person that I see myself as? Like, what are my actual goals in life? So instead of just, I want to be the best at this institution, it's, I want to set up this kind of life. So, I want to have some money. Higher ed does not pay very well. So it very much is a passion career if you want to work in academia or in student affairs. So money was a small factor of it. I want to have a car that's nice.
It's more of an important factor than people allow it to be. I think people are always hesitant to say that money's important, but once you get to a certain age, you can't make those sacrifices anymore. You want to live a certain way, and it's totally, totally fine.
Right. And that's what I sort of saw myself doing. And the other thing too is when you picture that image of yourself of, when you have the suit on or what's it, like, what does that look like to you? And for me, it's having the suit on, it's being the boss lady. It's the, like, I'm in charge and executive. I'm like, well, I can't do that in higher ed.
Right.
And the other thing too, is I started shifting my focus towards, the other thing that, especially as women, we're afraid to say, family. Like, I was getting serious with my boyfriend. We were talking about possibly getting married. It was like, okay, I want to have a family at some point. I need money to do that.
Yes, a lot.
But I also want to make sure that I am in a career that aligns with who I am, and that having that family also fits into it. And I just didn't feel like, for me personally, staying in student affairs was going to line up with all of those other things that I wanted. So believe it or not, that was the first thing. The second thing, I know all of that was the first thing. The second thing was sort of the initial tug. Was shortly after I got my master's. I was in that first big girl postmaster's job. And actually about 7 months later, I was laid off. So this is pre-COVID layoff, when other people still had jobs. So I did not have maybe the same kind of support networks that I think people have now. And I'm like, this is my little plug for rely on those support networks because they're a great buffer while you're job searching. But I think I didn't have that as much, but I had Holly. And that's when we started, because that's when I started reflecting a little bit on here are some of the things I wish I had known about my graduate school experience. Here are some of the things like I wish I had known about going into this career and about this field. And Holly started also, she's like, yeah, I wish I had known some of these things about grad school as well. And so through that, we had kind of started getting to that point of the very early stages of what would become our current business, now Flourishing Professional. And so it was that first tug when I was laid off that I started thinking, okay, what is it that I like doing? Do I still want to do this for the rest of my life? And at that point, some of it was more of the confidence piece also. Even though I wasn't laid off because of something I had done that was negative. In fact, nobody wanted to see me go. I think they were crying more than I was. And it was that sort of feeling, though, of like, did I do something wrong? Is this the right career for me? And I think part of this, too, was I had to almost prove to myself I could still do it. And right. I don't think I realized then that's what I was really doing when I was still trying to look for jobs in that field. So fast forward 5 short months of being unemployed, which actually is short, I have learned, especially right now. Yeah. So I ended up then moving to Georgia and working at a university there. And it was throughout the couple years that I was working there that I again started really questioning, do I want to be in this field? And I had actually applied for another job at another institution. It actually would have been the same job I had for a lot more money. And I remember acing that interview. Like it's one of those like drops mic, I'm good to go. They love me. This is great. And I did get the offer. The only person that I don't think I had connected well with was the person I would have directly been reporting to. So that also put up some flags for me. But the other big thing was all the while that while I'm doing this interview, everything's going well. And I felt like I was lying to myself. I was not lying in the interview. Right. I was presenting everything authentically. These are things I've done. I'm great. Hire me. That was the subtext. And then underneath it, I was really sitting there thinking, is this really me? And I just didn't have that same passion anymore. It's not me. And so then it got me thinking, what is it that I really like doing? And it's building those connections with people, providing some of that coaching, helping people figure out their goals. And then also the project side of creating and developing trainings. And so now I'm sort of at this place where I'm working on Flourishing Professional, but I'm still also building in another career in learning and development and trying to now move into sort of the corporate area.
I really love that idea of kind of breaking it down to the core components of what you like to do, because multiple jobs or multiple career paths kind of offer you the ability to hone in on those specific skills. And so the fact that you knew that you wanted to kind of do the coaching and the walking through people with certain steps, like breaking it down into those little pieces. I love that for advice of how to figure out exactly what you want to do, because that's the backbone of what you're going to be doing. And there's multiple different career fields that could give you that. And so what you're saying about being able to find the right career field that gives you that, but also gives you kind of that personal satisfaction as well, and being that person who you want to be. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Can I walk us back through really quick before we get to Holly's story? I want to walk back through, you mentioned that both of you had this idea of things that you wish you had known before going into your graduate experience. And a lot of our listeners are currently deciding on whether to go into a graduate experience. So I think it would be great if you could share maybe some of those things that you wish you had known.
Sure. So, this is where Flourishing Professional really started. We originally said we were going to write a book that would have just been things I wish I had known. There actually, I think, is a book with a similar title. So we did not know that at the time, and we obviously did not commit to the book, but we started talking about the things that we had experienced. And for one, even the differences in some of the programs. So my master's program was very, and it was practitioner based. You can choose between having something that's more research based, especially when you're talking about student affairs, which is, there's research in it, but it's not necessarily an academic field, even though it's at universities. And there are many people who argue with me on that because you can still go that route. But for the majority of people, they're getting that degree because they want to be a practitioner. And so I knew I wanted to have a program that was practitioner based, but I also didn't realize that I wouldn't have as many research opportunities. And so that was a surprise and maybe a little bit of a disappointment. And I enjoyed my program, and I don't want to completely knock it here because I think it's a good program for the people who, if it's what they're looking for. But I didn't even know that that's really what I was looking for. And I remember when I did do some work with someone, we were taking her dissertation and actually trying to turn it into an article that could be published. And I don't know if you've touched on this with your viewers before, but that's a long process.
It is.
I'm not going to get into that too much. But so one of the things that I did was work on the lit review for it, especially bringing it up to date because you're talking about a number of years that have gone by at this point. And my schedule didn't really allow for that. And grad school doesn't really allow you much time anyway. And so I remember it being a huge fight just to get the graduate school, which was separate from our program, to allow me to add those credit hours. And I was like, in any other program, you get thesis hours. But I didn't have that with my program. And so I was really frustrated by that it was difficult to do research at an institution that's known for research.
Right.
And so those were things it's like I didn't consider. And so that brought us into our conversation of understanding the difference between the university and the name and then the actual program.
Right.
And so that was a big piece. The other thing was about looking at some of those outside characteristics. You know, when you choose your institution for undergrad, a lot of times you're like, oh, I like this school. Maybe it's even, I want a party school. But, you know, you look for those things that are, you like to do, they have the program I want. But there aren't as many considerations, especially it's not important to a lot of traditional age undergrads who are, 17, 18, to make sure that there's family housing or that there's, affordable restaurants or these types of things. And I used to joke in grad school that, in undergrad, you're okay eating ramen every night. Not that I had to, actually. I was lucky I didn't. But you're okay eating ramen every night. And in grad school, though, you're still on that same no money sort of phase. And you're not okay eating ramen anymore.
Right.
And I realized choosing the University of Mississippi. Now, my husband, Sean, was already there. I was already living there. I had actually been working at the institution before I had decided to go there for grad school. One of the things that we both had realized being there were some of the little things about like political differences coming from the Northeast and food differences. Brittany, I know you and I have had conversations at length
oh my gosh.
about food
the
options.
lack of Mexican food. Yes, that was the worst.
and just, it's like a little thing that you wouldn't even think would be a big deal, but this is a place that you're living, and hey, fried chicken is great, but I just didn't grow up with it constantly.
No, it definitely introduced me to some new food. I have never had better macaroni and cheese than I have had from people who made it in the South.
Oh my gosh, yes.
But yes, I desperately missed real Mexican food.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure Holly can touch on some of the other things because I want to hear her talk at some point. I feel like I'm not even giving her a chance here to talk about some of the things because it's such a long list of things that we wish we had known about graduate school. And one of the packages that we're offering for Flourishing Professional is that sort of grad school matching process where we provide that custom approach and help people figure out the things that they really are looking for that they may not even realize they're looking for
that's amazing.
Their graduate programs or professional programs, if it's law school or you're getting an MBA. And so that we can help them do that research.
That's awesome. As somebody who does academic advising for undergrads and a lot of them planning to go to graduate school, very much needed. A lot of students, I think the hard part is, you talk about hidden curriculum in undergrad, right? There's all this stuff that people don't know. And there's so much of it for graduate school. And the biggest problem is undergraduates don't know what to be asking. Just like you were saying, you don't know that the food choice matters when you go to grad school or affordable housing or whatever, you just think, oh, I just need to get into a program. I have so many students that are just like, well, I don't care where it is. I just need to get in. And I'm like, you will care where it is. Like, if you want to save your mental health, you do need to care a little bit. And so I think that's an amazing resource. And I know Holly has something to say too, because she got really excited.
Oh, we talk about hidden curriculum all the time.
That was the backbone of my dissertation,
Oh, yeah.
In curriculum. Yeah, that was actually one of my frameworks that I built my dissertation on. So yeah, absolutely. I think that what I learned, what I wish I would have known is that if you have a value conflict with the school or the research they're doing, that can come back and be problematic later down the road when you're doing your own research. But the one thing I wish I would have really have known, and I've spoken to Melissa about this, is I really wish I would have known that there's places on campus when you do have conflict with your professors, that there is a structure that can help mediate if there is a conflict. It's not just, they don't have all the power that you do as a student have a voice.
Right.
It probably, you talk about toxic environments and mental health. I think on the grad school, if you're in a situation where you are in conflict with one of your professors, and it happened in both my undergrad and my my graduate and my doctoral levels, it would have been nice to know that I wasn't alone, because it felt like it was me versus the faculty.
Well, and you always feel less powerful in those situations, and it's frightening to speak up because you could lose your position and all of that. And I think it's definitely important to know that you're not alone, because I think, unfortunately, those toxic environments seem more pervasive than I would like to imagine they are.
And I think I would have just done a little bit more research, because like Melissa, I went into a practitioner's program, and then I realized about halfway through, I had a value shift and a career shift in my goals. So I should have maybe looked for a program that would have allowed me to jump into the research side instead of staying locked into a practitioner side. So it's really important that you, I guess, research, other alternative options when you're looking at a grad program.
Right.
Should you change your mind, can you move laterally?
And the other piece that you hit on that I want to make sure we highlight again was that mental health was a big one that we talked about. And that's another reason why we've sort of gone the route of starting Flourishing Professional, was that there's so much stake around mental health to begin with. And then when you get into mental health in graduate school, I just feel like it's even worse. Like, we're just now looking at it. Even just in the past couple of years, there's been more studies on graduate students and their mental health throughout that time. An advisor can make or break your program and your experience. And then universities sort of struggle on sort of, okay, are they students, they're employees, there's sort of this feeling of we don't know how to handle them.
And I feel like that's been amplified with COVID, because I feel like a lot of times students are saying, oh, well, they treat me like faculty when it's convenient for them, but then they treat me like a student when it's convenient for them.
Correct.
Yeah.
I
also,
No, go on.
I usually point out, like, I think Holly kind of brought this up a little bit, is this idea of kind of, can you move laterally? I always bring up, do you want a collaborative environment or more of like that competition-based environment? Because different people do want different things. And so whichever one you want or whichever one motivates you the best is better for you. I specifically looked for collaborative environments. Like, when I ended up at the University of Mississippi with Melissa, one of the reasons I chose that was because the person I had applied to work with there and got accepted to had actually left the university right before I went there. And so they were like, well, you can work with somebody else in like a different field, but then you can just move around and kind of figure it out. And like, they really allowed collaboration. I got to, work with somebody in a different discipline on a project one time for a different research. And that meant a lot to me. But then there are other ones where it's a little more competition based. And so trying to figure out that environment, I think, is really important for your mental health. Because if you end up in the wrong one, it could be disastrous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was in a competitive program when I should have been in something more collaborative.
Right.
And I think that also knowing your own personality traits and your personality tendencies can go a long way in matching with the correct, grad program, which is why our package exists, to help.
Right? We're in psychology. Shouldn't we all just do like personality tests when we go into match?
Well, that's one of the things I scream about in sort of the L&D career side I'm in, is that, you know, some of the things I'm seeing is they'll still use assessments that psychology has come out and debunked and been like, no, don't use this. And learning it about it's like, look at all these great assessments we use. And like, some of them are good. And they're great conversation starters, but they are not the end all be all.
No. I know. I just wrote my lecture on like learning styles and how they're a myth, like right after all my students told me their learning styles. I'm like, I'm so sorry.
I agree. Because it can change. It also depends on the subject too.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Holly, do you want to kind of, I know we're in a groove, but do you want to backtrack really quick and kind of start from your beginning of what you wanted to be when you were a child?
Sure. Yeah. Because I have a unconventional, I guess, way that I ended up getting to where I am today.
Yeah, so, I like those.
Very unconventional. I knew I wanted to teach music since I was 5. I come from a family of entrepreneurs. Both my mom and dad run businesses, so self-employment was always a thing growing up. So when my siblings went to the corporate world, that was a little bit weird. So I just kind of followed along with what the rest of my family did. So obviously, I studied, my instruments, and I was on track to become a performer. When I was in high school, I took on my first private student. My teacher had suggested I start to teach others to help my own technique. They say if you really want to know a subject, you teach the subject.
Right.
So one student turned into 2, turned into 3. So by the time I was in high school, I had a private business. I didn't have to work at the mall like most peers my age.
Awesome.
But I also was writing because I took journalism in high school. We had one of those schools that actually had journalism in a paper that was actually pretty good.
Nice.
And then when I went to college, so I was all set to become a professional musician, like a performer, not teacher. I'm like, well, I already have students. I want to go for the New York Philharmonic. And then I did not make it into any of the schools that I applied for because I narrow-mindedly only applied for the Ivy League equivalent of conservatories, like Juilliard and stuff like that. No other safety schools. That's not, basically my story is what not to do when you school. And so as a result, I ended up going to a state college. Purchase College is a great school, as an undeclared major because I didn't know what to do, because at that point I didn't get into any music programs. So I took classes in everything. And I discovered that I really liked journalism, especially editing. So at this time, I still had all of my private students. My private music business was growing. I was still adding students to my roster. And I started to then academically do some academic editing for my friends and family members. So it also helped my editing as a journalist in my program. So then I graduated and I still had my business and it was still growing, but I did take a full-time job. I lasted 2 weeks in a full-time job.
Oh no.
I did. It was not for me. I didn't like someone telling me what to do because at this point I never had to, because I had, my private business all throughout high school and college. So I built that up even more. I remember I even asked my dad going, Dad, is it okay that I'm not working these corporate jobs? My friends are getting some of these amazing business deals and they're getting these amazing positions. And my dad said, Holly, you're meant to be self-employed. We never viewed you as being someone who would thrive in the corporate environment because you're way too stubborn and you don't like being told what to do. So he goes, just keep doing what you're doing. He goes, when you're old, I said, but all my friends are making fun of me because they're getting these fabulous paychecks. And I'm like, like Melissa eating ramen. And he's like, don't worry about it. You're only going to get bigger. He goes, trust yourself. You're going to grow, set the foundation strong. I'm like, okay, Dad. So then, because I moved out and you have to pay the rent. So I did take on a part-time job teaching at a preschool. And I discovered I really liked classroom teaching, which was not a huge jump from, private teaching. Mm-hmm. And so I decided, and then I got a job teaching music at high school and middle school. So I finally got to teach orchestra and decided I needed the master's. I really liked classroom teaching. I went back, got my master's, met my husband, who's Melissa's cousin. That's how Melissa and I met. And then a few years in, I decided I really wanted to get my doctorate because my doctorate's in educational leadership. So I'm like, you know what? I did 6 months filling in for department head of the music department. And I'm like, I think I want to be an administrator. That'd be cool, running a school. And then, so I got into the doctoral program and then decided after one semester, I did not like administration. I decided that an administrator was not going to get me to the goals that I saw for myself as a teacher and for the benefit of the future of my students. So I still stayed in the doctoral program because I'm in a doctoral program. I might as well finish it. I was already at least 1 or 2 classes in. And so I switched my focus of my dissertation from a practitioner to more of a research theoretical, which is more like an educational research. I decided I really liked educational research and policy and stuff. So I still had my private business. I had left my the last year of the doctoral program, I left my teaching position at the school because at this time I had started to pick up more academic editing. Like I started tackling on the dissertations, the peer review journals, like all the stuff I did in journalism school and kept on doing. Just now on a bigger scale. So both businesses, so I started a completely separate business. So I had 2 businesses and was teaching at a school. Something had to go because I had to finish the doctorate. So I left my teaching position and just stayed 100% self-employed. And now I have both businesses still. And then I remember Melissa and I were talking about what we should have done differently. And my own experiences in grad school could be a book on what not to do.
Yeah.
Everything you shouldn't have done, I probably did. So Melissa and I were talking, and we said that I think that this is a great idea to help people. So, and that's how we ended up with Flourishing Professional, but I still have my editing business and I still have my private music business, and they're both growing. And my dad was correct. He goes, just keep at it. He goes, you'll be very happy when you reach your 30s. I'm like, and he was right. Like totally, like completely unconventional, but,
Right.
But I thought was interesting is hindsight. When I finished my doctorate and started doing academic editing for educational research journals and dissertations and master's theses, I then got to see the intersection of my undergraduate degree in journalism and my master's degree and doctoral degree in education. So I thought they were going to be completely unrelated fields, but it turns out that they're right now like all turning into being very overlapped and very interdisciplinary.
Oh, yeah. What I love about journalism is it's essentially education. You're just teaching a wider audience.
Correct.
Like I am kind of secretly, not so secretly anymore, obsessed with like science communication. So journalism related to education research, science research, psychology research, all of this stuff, trying to get it out because we have such a huge block. You have paywalls from all this research that we're doing in universities. And I love that journalists are now, I guess they always have been, like getting the information out. They're just teaching a wider audience. So I think that they're incredibly overlapped.
One of the things that actually I didn't think would help me ever was, I knew that journalism would help me with writing because, you learn to communicate to other people, but I didn't think it would actually help me when I went for my doctorate. It ended up being the most useful degree because I already knew how to do research. I already knew how to vet research, and I already knew how to write in a technical manner. Because most people, especially the dissertations that I edit, I see a lot of people talk the way they speak, and academic writing is very, cut and dry. And that's almost like journalism. Because when I did freelance journalism work at the papers, but I was always the beat reporter that had to write, about crime and the board meetings and town meetings. That stuff is very, very dry. And cut to the point. So it really worked to my favor in when I was writing my dissertation and the evaluations. When you take them in school, my professors will come back going, "Well, you have amazing writing skills." I'm like, I went to journalism school. I should have amazing writing skills. But it's different than I have a friend who went for creative writing and is struggling because he's like, it's such a different like night and day experience. So
I remember when I first got into school, I remember somebody told me to get rid of all the adjectives. They're like, you're basically never going to write with an adjective again. Like and you do, but it's that's how different it is you're not trying to create a picture anymore. You're just trying to communicate and say something. So it's a very different writing style.
Correct. My first journalism course was the same way. Walked into J1, they said you're only allowed to use the word twice in an article, and you're not allowed to really use. It's really just the facts. You know? So that does. You never know what. So I feel like you're starting out. You don't know what you're doing. It's always a good idea. No matter what you do, it seems like will benefit you down the line, even if you can't see those connections right away.
Yeah, that's what I've learned a lot doing this podcast, because in everybody's stories, there's all these connections that end up interweaving when they have like these unconventional stories. And I'm like, it comes back around. They all kind of help you no matter what. And even having diverse experiences that don't seem related, I always think is a huge benefit, because you can see a problem and attack a problem from a different way.
And also it expands, because I have so many different businesses, it expands the network. So, and it also helps because when Melissa and I, when we're starting Flourishing Professional, we have a broader network of people who we can tap for advice, you know, and in this day and age, you know, especially when you're building a network from, you know, or building a business from the bottom, you know, it's important to have people who can guide you and offer advice along the way.
That's good. That's actually a question I had wanted to ask. So we can kind of weave it into both of you starting Flourishing Professional. For those out there who maybe want to start their own business,
do it.
How do you do it? So you've done it multiple times. So what's the first steps? So where did you start? How did you get this thing off the ground?
So for one, go ahead.
Wait, Flourishing Professional or just businesses in general?
In general, and Flourishing Professional. We kind of weave them both in there.
Okay. Melissa, do you want to take this?
Well, I was going to say that since you Holly touched on having that network, it's been helpful for when we have some of those conversations of, okay, I think we need to ask an accountant this question, or okay, we need to ask a lawyer this question. She's like, I already got it. We got our people. Nice. So thankfully we didn't have to go through that process that a lot of people have to go through. But a lot of it, like we'll have conversations about things like when we talked about pricing, for example, because this is still new for us and we're still building out our packages. We were trying to figure out what is this going to look like? How are we going to price this out? And what we essentially do, so if somebody reaches out to Flourishing Professional, first thing we do is set up a consultation call. And that call, there is a fee for, but it's essentially they're interviewing us and we're interviewing them. And we're trying to make sure we're a good fit. And if we're not, that's okay. We want to help you make sure that you have the right resources in your end. So when we had that conversation, I said, okay, never do anything for free. We have to know our worth. And I'm, throwing out all these fun terms and buzzwords and things. It's true. Like Holly looks at me, she said, "You're so right. Where did you get this?" And it's like, I've been listening to podcasts for the last year. But it's true. It's like podcasts like these where you get to hear other people's stories, having conversations with other people who've started those businesses or are in those fields. It's so beneficial to just be able to sit there and talk through your ideas with somebody who's been there. And the other, we've been working on this technically for 2 years from when we said we were going to start a book, but really a year from this is going to be our business. We're going to provide these consulting services and we'll have a blog. That conversation really shifted a year ago, and it takes time. You have to go at your own pace because we want to make sure we have our ducks in a row. We're listening to other people's stories. And every time I see, like if I'm in one of the Facebook groups that's online about entrepreneurs and I'm looking to see, somebody says, hey, I had this awful experience. A client didn't pay me and like I gave them everything. And then somebody else is, going, yeah, I learned that lesson the hard way too. That's why I always make sure people pay X amount up front or things like that. Little things that you don't really think about, especially because conversations around money in particular are really difficult to have. Like a lot of those pieces we're getting from seeing other people's stories.
Right. So it's like finding the hidden curriculum of business from other people.
Exactly.
Another thing about starting a business is you have to realize that you will make mistakes and you have to become comfortable with a high degree of risk. And I think that a lot of people get intimidated from starting businesses because they're like, well, what if I fail? I'm like, well, So what if you fail? If you fail, you fail. I have learned more from my businesses, from my failures and epic mistakes, like that's why Flourishing Professional, as I said, we learned our mistakes from grad school, but it works the same in business. If you are afraid of making mistakes, then you're not really going to learn as much. I find I learned a lot more, and I actually will advise if anyone wants to start a business, find a mentor. I have different mentors for the different businesses. I have a mentor of just like general business. I also have a mentor for specific. And now that I've been teaching and editing for so long, people are now asking me about how to get into the game. So I've become a mentor. So because the key is to, as Melissa said, you want to talk to people because, the pitfalls are there. Sometimes you can't avoid those pitfalls. You're going to find out by following them in yourself. You're going to fall into those holes by yourself. But as I said, your network is important, and also having someone you can turn to when you get stuck, like, oh no, what do I do now? Or how do I resolve this?
And do you have advice on how to find these networks or mentors or how to reach out to people?
Yeah, so I can jump in on this one because I'm in an interesting experiment right now with LinkedIn. We recently did a blog post on LinkedIn. Holly looks at me. She's like, I think you'd be a good one to write this post. And I was like, well, somebody just ripped apart my LinkedIn. I don't know if I can do this. But actually, the past couple of months has been an interesting experiment on increasing my LinkedIn network. And I don't just mean just clicking connect with the first person that pops up. I mean, going on their profile and connecting from that page where you can add a little note that says, hi, I met you at XYZ, or I find that you're in my area, or we both went to Penn State, or we both went to University of Mississippi, some sort of connecting piece there to bring up with them and just say, I want to learn from you. And I have been so pleasantly surprised with the amount of people who will come back and say, sure, I can give you like 30 minutes. Let's have a conversation.
Yes.
And so
many more people than you would think.
Yes. So it's scary, though, to send that first message. And it's still scary even now with like the 20th or 30th or 100th to send that message because you don't know if that person's going to respond. But here's the thing. You're not in a different place if they don't respond. You haven't, so you just try the next person. And so the other area which has been helpful for the networking side and learning throughout this process, I had mentioned before, were some of those Facebook groups. I guess don't really ask me how, I maybe just Googling, but I keep popping up and finding all of these Facebook groups. And so joining these communities has been beneficial for having additional people in that support side, as well as like to learn from and to hear their stories.
Yeah, I always, on this podcast and in real life, I always tout the benefits of social media for networking and connection, especially right now during COVID. Like, there's no better way. I've met most of my connections, if not all of them, through social media in some way or another. And it's been life-changing.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about Flourishing Professional and how, so we know a little bit about where it came from with these kind of mistakes you made in graduate school. Walk us through a little bit about what Flourishing Professional is.
Yeah, so we empower individuals to navigate the academic and the working worlds. And we do this by offering individual coaching or consulting from deciding on and applying to graduate and professional schools, but also supporting them during that time. And then helping them figure out, what's next? I have this fancy degree. Now what's next? And so we actually have done an exercise. Here's another little tip for starting a business. We did a little exercise where we said, okay, what's our ideal flourishing professional client? What are we ideally trying to become with Flourishing Professional? And so we sort of joked around a little bit with this. And we said, our goal is to become the Michael Kors or the Tiffany's of career and graduate school consulting. But it's cute and it's funny, but it actually is true because we provide this personal customized touch. There are a lot of career services out there. There are some programs out there that help for undergrads. Those students who are typically in undergrad do have some ties to their institution that are going to, they'll have a career services office. They have their academic advisors. Brittany, you mentioned you have these conversations with them too. So they have some of those ties. But if you have somebody who's looking to reinvent themselves, maybe, and I think of my mother a little bit here too, because she's such an amazing inspiration for me, who she's raised 3 kids and she's looking to reinvent herself. And that's been a process. And so what does that look like? How do I reinvent myself? What is my next step? So it's for those questions and those crossroads that we really look to help people. And then the other piece that we talked about was that hidden curriculum. that comes from that conversation that Holly and I had. Maybe we'll call it the wine and ranting session, of things that we wish we had known about grad school. She's laughing right now at me.
It was a great conversation.
See, but where we can help people with that, because it's different even from undergrad. So even if somebody is doing that traditional route, where they went to undergrad when they were 18, and then they're deciding to go into a graduate program right after undergrad, even with those ties, there are still so many things that like are so different about going through the graduate school process than from undergrad. And the hidden curriculum is almost entirely
graduate school is a whole different area. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who's teaching a graduate school class, and she's like, I thought that in graduate school they would know these things, but I realized that undergraduate is so different that we have to teach them all these different things again, because it's just a different world.
Well, there's a new trend where there is a change in students, and that's where Flourishing Professional is filling that gap.
Nice.
Like we'll help provide those things that are missing to make you be successful in grad school.
Good.
And we also, and the other thing too, like I said, is helping people figure out that what's next. So our sort of services are in 3 areas. That process of applying and getting into your graduate professional program, like that matching service that we were discussing earlier, for those who are currently in it and navigating that process while you're there. And then the what's next part is actually an entire different section where we do touch on more of the traditional career counseling pieces. And that's where we're going to do a lot of goals alignment, conflict management services. I have a little passion hobby side of conflict management and helping people navigate that, and through some different tools for nonviolent communication. And I even practice some of these tools with my husband. Sometimes he appreciates it, sometimes he doesn't. And I also sometimes mess it up too. Like, I am not perfect. I still scream at him when I shouldn't be, especially now during COVID and we live in a one bedroom.
Oh my gosh.
So, and even going back to our Flourishing Professional story, I had said before that we had started off with, okay, we're going to write a book. Then it became, what if we do this blog and gear it towards millennials, since, and this is a little bit of a soapbox I have about everybody just says if they don't like it, it's a millennial thing. And actually millennials are like 40 now. And Holly and I sort of represent that spectrum. I didn't say that. Not that you were. You just did.
No, it amazes me that Gen Z is so old already. Where I'm like Gen Z's out of college now. Like, what is going on?
We shifted around that because, like I said, that for the mother who's reinventing herself, that could be somebody who's in the older side of a millennial generation, but it could be somebody in Gen X. So we're not really tied to that at this point, but that was sort of one of our early discussions. And then it, because we sort of talked about all of the advice that's out there right now about your career, is coming from generations based on a type of work and career path that just doesn't exist anymore. Especially now during COVID, with everybody working remotely, there's a greater demand for changes at companies. And I think on the positive side, if there is one, that we may see this shift in technology use and a greater shift in companies valuing their employees' well-being. There are a lot of great wellness initiatives I've seen that have come out of this. So that kind of work doesn't exist anymore. You don't just get that first job out of school and work there for 30 years and they're going to notice that you're great and you're going to move up the line. And I'm not saying every career path was like that either in the past. But it's just that things have changed.
Yes, millennials and Gen Z are entering a different workforce than before. I have this conversation with my mom all the time, who is an entrepreneur as well, and she owns her own business. And now she's starting to hire millennials, and she's like, I just don't get it. They don't stick around. And I'm like, well, are you paying them well enough? And she's like, well, no, it's an entry level. Like, do you have the chance for promotion? Well, not really. And I'm like, because the work world doesn't offer stability as it used to. And so now the younger generations aren't giving that same loyalty because we aren't getting it.
And things cost more too. I mean,
they do.
And the pay hasn't gone up. I remember that first job that I got after my master's. So at this point, we're talking about I have a master's level education. I already have some experience. And this job that I'm going into, and I enjoyed this work. This was when I was laid off from, but I loved working at that place and I love the people and still am in contact with them. But I won't forget when I did tell my mom what they offered me for pay, that she goes, oh, that's exactly what I was offered when I was done with law school. And I was like, Mom, sorry to date you here, but that was like 30 years ago.
Yeah, things cost a lot more now.
So yeah, I mean, that's the fact that was crazy to me. Like the fact that we're offering people in these positions starting out the same amount that you would offer somebody with pretty much a similar level of education. Granted, you would expect a lawyer to be paid a little bit more than somebody in higher ed because higher ed just doesn't really pay as much. They don't really have as much to pay either. You'd expect there to be maybe a little bit of a difference, but for that to be the same after 30 years.
Well, and I think we talk about hidden curriculum a lot. I think there's this hidden idea of what a livable salary is. Like, you really need to compare it to where you live and what things cost. And I know I talk to students all the time about salary, and I'm like, well, what do you think is high? I was like, I'll tell them mine. I make $60,000 a year. I used to think that was extremely high. Like, when I was in my master's program, I was striving for that. And then my students are like, oh my gosh, I would love to make 60,000. Like, it sounds like so much. And then I'm like, oh, I also can't afford a house, and I can't afford to put my kids in karate or soccer. Like, you think it's a lot, but with the cost of living now, it's not a lot. And like, we're a dual income household, and it's still not enough. So like, you really have to start comparing these things and thinking about salary and thinking about money, where I think it's been so taboo to talk about money for so long that students don't even know that $60,000 where we live is not sustainable, and that they need to strive for more. And they think that that's so high that companies can offer that to them because they're willing to accept it.
And I think that's exactly even one of the things too, when I was looking at master's programs for student affairs, and I was thinking, oh yeah, these positions, they're offering like $50,000 for this. Like that's good money. Like I can live off of that. Not realizing actually that you can't, or maybe I could, but I can't have a family on that.
It depends on what type of lifestyle. Like I think it's hard because in school, even in the master's programs, we're comfortably living in a 500 square foot apartment, right? And so we're like, oh my gosh, with this, like with 60,000, I could move up. Like I could get a 2-bedroom apartment, but you don't realize, oh, well, I can't get a house, and I can't get, the fancier car that I want, or I can't, I can't send my kids to the best school district or things like that. So,
or even the mommy threads that you see of like, hey, it's my kid just turned 3 and I just paid off the bill for having him at the hospital.
Oh my gosh.
It's like those things. And I mean, that's a whole other issue getting into with healthcare in the States. But
yeah,
I mean, that's the other thing too that people don't talk about. And you see these crazy articles out there too of this is how much money you should have saved up at this age and how much money should be going to this. And I don't remember where it was. It might have been Forbes, but there was one that went around recently with this pie chart. And it's like, here's X amount being given to charity. And now I do give to charity, but it's probably a few dollars here, a few dollars there, because like, I'm sorry, I can't put together a fancy pie chart and have, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars to give to charity. And I'm looking at this going, who is this person that has enough money to do these kinds of things?
I love when those things circle around because my social media network like tears it down. We're like, what? Like, especially recently, there was like an academic one because there's this weird myth that academics, professors make a lot of money. And like, there's this weird thing where people are like, oh, just those professors driving around in their Porsche. And I'm like, what professor can afford a Porsche? Like,
I think that's and so by TV.
Right. Yeah. Oh gosh, the offices that professors have on TV, and I'm like, where did they get that? Like,
like that's, or even the technology, even the computers that they have. I mean, I remember walking into some jobs where it's like, okay, and you have a computer, and I'm sitting there going, it's like not turning on, or it's taking forever to turn on. And I'm like, what is this dial up? And it's right. They basically are like, here's a computer from 15 years ago. And now we want you to, do
make it work
crazy. Like, yeah, exactly. Have like 4 applications going at once. We want you to create some online course. And it's like, This computer can't even do that. It can't handle it. It's like crashing 3 times in the process of trying to do it.
Yeah. But those like pie charts that go around on the internet and they're like, oh, you just have, the worst part is they always say like, oh, the person's spending like $500 on rent or something. And I'm like, where in the world do you spend $500 in rent? Even in Mississippi, we didn't pay $500 for rent. Like, and that was probably the cheapest it gets. So I'm like, those things are automatically flawed. So if you're listening to this and you're trying to just find out what salary you need, do not look at those
No.
weird charts that they pass around online of how much you should be spending, because they're insane. Like, you can't pay $500 in rent. They don't talk about healthcare that you're contributing to or anything like that.
I mean, I'll tell you, the last place that I worked, living in Georgia, they wanted to offer $34,000. And this is the first time I was like so proud of myself that I actually negotiated. That there's that know your worth piece. And I was so excited that we got it up to 38,000. Yeah. and people might be thinking on this, well, okay, well, that's Georgia. We weren't in the Atlanta area. We were actually, well, depending on the traffic and the day, we were actually either an hour or 2 or possibly even 3 hours south of Atlanta. And so we weren't in a town that people made a lot of money. But even still, that apartment and the cost of living and groceries and all those things add up. And guess what? That money was not really enough.
Or even just, you were talking about starting a family. I pay a third of my salary for childcare. And so that's a third that's already gone. And then the mortgage is another third. Mm-hmm. And now I have, $10,000, $15,000 left for everything else. Car payments, groceries, bills, entertainment, everything, so you have to kind of break stuff down into that. What's the biggest amount, like the biggest bills you're going to be paying? Can it cover that?
Mm-hmm. And even for some of our, when we think about that flourishing professional client, that's somebody who's, reinventing themselves and has had a career already, and they're looking to either, there's that buzzword, pivot. They're looking to pivot, or they're looking to, get that advanced degree to figure out what's next. And they're probably listening to this conversation and they can relate, going like, oh yeah, yep, we have all of those bills, all of those things. And it's like, how am I going to go to grad school? Like, we actually just put out a post recently on our blog that was all about financing grad school. I had a conversation with a woman the other day where we talked about, I was like, oh, there's literally a grant that you can get that's supposed to be geared towards women who are a little bit, and I'm not saying old, but older. They're not your non-traditional age student.
Yeah.
They're non-traditional. They're not your traditional student. So, there are things out there to help finance. And higher ed is also in this reckoning period right now, where they're not sustainable and they have to figure out a way to be. So I'm really curious to see, in a post-COVID world, where higher ed goes and what that looks like.
Yeah. And then, is that kind of a service that you offer with Flourishing Professional to help people find like grants and things like that if they're planning to go back to school?
So one of the things, if we're helping somebody, if we were to get like a full service package, like if you were to like take your car and you're like, I need the works, right? One of the things that we will touch on is, here are some of the different places you can look for funding. And we build that into our conversations. We talk about, again, when we get into those conversations about goals, like, what are you currently paying for? What are those goals? Where do you want to be? And then a discussion of, here are some of the places you can look for funding. And we do try and help people through some of those processes. We actually have a new upcoming post that's all about the FAFSA. And I'm going to actually turn this over to Holly to talk about, because she's a little bit more of our in-house guru when it comes to finding some of these resources.
So yeah, there's many different places. I'm sorry, like you glitched out for a little bit. So can you repeat the question?
If you guys offer a service to help people find like grants or, resources for if they're trying to pivot or go back to school, how do you help them?
Well, as Melissa said, we have a package, it's built in. But yes, we have offered many different packages to help you find those there's plenty of services. We actually we have a post recently about the various different places. So we have a whole network and resources of different ways and creative ways to finance your grad school journey. Because sometimes in this world, you have to think outside the box to finance your journey, and the money to finance your advanced degrees is available in some of the most interesting places. Like when I did my graduate degree, I did not realize that because of the fact that I worked at a private school, because it was affiliated, I got like 25% off my tuition. I didn't realize that until I signed up for the grad school, that all that extra money was there. So like there is tons of money. You just have to know where to look for it. I think it's easier because I think when students go to apply for financial aid, they think undergrad. without realizing that there's always, when there's a dialogue about financing your education, it always seems to be undergrad, but the graduate students have our own, levels and availability of resources. We just have to know to look for it. I think that people are just quieter on that particular subject than undergrad.
Yeah. And in higher ed, we refer to it sometimes as the higher ed price tag. Like the price tag that you see for school is not what most people end up paying. Right. And that's true for undergrad as well. And so a lot of the conversations we'll have with people also come from, like one of the things we touched on before about, separating the name of an institution from their actual program. Because you may have an institution that's like a top undergrad institution, their name is well known. And then when, if you want to study something in particular, for grad school, their grad program maybe isn't actually rated as well as some of the others. So that name, depending on what you want to go for, may not mean as much. And so it comes to that conversation around what's the return on investment? Like, what are you looking for here? And so, I have a friend who actually is in school, and she found an online school in another state that was a lot cheaper than some of the other name schools, because at this point she's in her career. She wants the degree to help her to get a little more knowledge, to use some of those skills in her current job, and also to, have some more leverage in negotiating pay. So like there's a couple pieces involved in why she's there. But she doesn't necessarily need the network that you would get if you were to go to, Harvard Law, right? You don't need necessarily all of those pieces then at that point. So she found a school that was online, still has a good rating, obviously, but they're not maybe as expensive as some of the other ones because she doesn't necessarily need that. She has her network. And I'm not saying that it would be a waste to do in the others, because if she wanted to go to Harvard Law or wanted to go to, another school with a big name, by all means do it. But I think that when you're talking about trying to find something that's going to be, help you be financially stable and is going to help your career in the future, you may not need to necessarily go for that big name school. It's about the education that you actually get when you're there and the reasons behind going there. And her company helps pay for part of that program. And that's the other thing too. A lot of companies may offer tuition assistance. And if they do, sometimes it's going to be only X amount of money. You're sort of limited in, okay, I can go to, this big name school and I can get all of these loans, or I can go to this school that's a great program where it's more affordable and in line with this. So I don't have to actually throw in that much, additional funding from myself, that the company is then paying for most of it instead of a small portion of it.
And I think that sometimes when people finance grad school, they think of the immediate, not necessarily all the interest you're going to pay later on, and that the cost does go up every year. Sometimes even goes up every semester. So the sticker price you get when you're looking at a school is not what you're going to ultimately pay when you finish school. So time and program is also an important consideration.
And there are options for, especially if the conversation shifts to going to school full time. There are options depending on the type of program where you could potentially have that paid for and maybe even have a stipend, albeit graduate stipends, I think all of us here can say are not that high. No. But at least then, that things you have money coming in. And so then if you're looking at maybe taking out a loan for something beyond that, it's a little bit to help sort of meet you the rest of the way. But you're not looking at taking out a loan to cover the cost of tuition. So for me, especially because I was in student affairs, those types of programs actually very easily tie into working on those university campuses and what are called graduate assistantships. I could refer to it as an internship, but it really is just a job because you have way more responsibilities than an internship might have. But I didn't pay tuition. I had tuition remission through my assistantship. But even just within the field I was looking in, just those programs for student affairs, I remember crossing some schools off the list because their assistantships didn't do that. And I was like, well, yes, I get paid, but if I still have to pay tuition, it doesn't matter. And I crossed it off because I had other options. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, if I'm able to go to school and not have to pay tuition, then why would I go to this other school?
And I think it's important to note that there are quite a bit of schools out there that offer tuition remission, especially for graduate programs, especially PhD programs, because they really don't want you to work outside. And so there are a lot out there. So if there's a school you're looking at that doesn't offer that, to really critically think, is this the school that's the best for me and I'm willing to take on kind of that debt to go there? Or is there a different option that still gets me to my end goal, but maybe leaves me a little bit more financially stable once I'm out?
And one of our conversations that we would have with someone may not be, here are options to finance. It might be, maybe grad school isn't even the right decision for you right now. And I don't mean like from a funding standpoint. I mean, maybe for the goals that you have right now, it might not be worth it, because like I said, it goes back to that return on investment. If you're not going to get that, why put yourself through it? We talked about that, how grad school, especially with mental health, and it's a very difficult process, that to choose to go through it, if it's something that you don't necessarily need or you aren't really ready to commit to, that can be extremely painful, and also maybe even help set you, back a little bit in your career.
Yeah.
So it might be, instead of a graduate program, we look at, hey, how about the certificate program? Because it could still help you get that pay raise that you want, and it could still help you get those skills that you want to apply at your work, but you may not need that extra degree.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always tell students to work backwards. What's the career you want? What do you want to do when you're done with that? Because I get a lot of students in my office that are, oh, I'm going to graduate school. Okay, well, why? Well, I don't know. Like, what type of graduate school are you going to? I don't know. I just need to go to graduate school. And I think there's this pervasive idea that's crept up from this kind of college boom that the higher the degree, the better. So, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to get that PhD. And I always have to stop. I've said it on this podcast before, and I say it in my office every day. The higher the degree does not equal higher money. Like, no. I told people all the time, I have a PhD. I make $60,000 a year. I have two siblings that did not go to college. One works in pest control. One works in an architect's office, and both of them make significantly more money than I do. And so we have this stigma that like you can't go into like careers anymore, like roofing or pest control or things like that. And I'm like, actually, they're making really good money in those careers, better than I am with my PhD. And so it's not this idea that the higher the education automatically equals more money. It doesn't. You have to do something else to kind of get that money. And so really critically thinking about, what do I want to do? What do I want my day-to-day life to look like? What do I want that career to look like? Just like Melissa said in the very beginning, what are my goals as an individual, as a professional, and how can I get there? And is graduate school the right fit? Because in some instances, it absolutely is. But in others, there might be different ways to get there.
I think that it ends up being, your goals versus expectations. So I think a lot of people go to school with the expectation that other people are expecting them to do A, B, C, but it's going to be at odds. I'm a big proponent of, only get the level of education that you need. I only went for my master's because I went into education. Yeah. And so traditionally, when I went to school for journalism, and the school I went to, they actually had a degree for journalism, which is an unusual thing. It was brand new because back in the day, in the beginning of journalism field, you didn't need a degree. The papers would just train you. So the degree in journalism is a fairly new concept, Yeah. So it's just a shift, of expectations. I don't know about Melissa, but I know my family expected me to go to college. That was non-negotiable.
And it is with a lot of people nowadays. And I think that's where it's starting to bleed into graduate school now, where, now we expect you to go to graduate school. And I think, again, hidden curriculum, one of the things we don't tell people is you can be overqualified for jobs. I've known a lot of people that have ended up overqualified. Like when I was in my master's program, I could barely get a job working at a coffee shop because everywhere else was like, no, like you're going for your master's, you have a bachelor's, like we can't pay you what you need. And I'm like, well, I need to survive. Yeah. But you can absolutely come out overqualified if you get too many degrees for what you actually want to do.
Oh, absolutely. And I joke with my private students that I'm overqualified to teach basic which is why I never make my students call me Dr. Sachs. I mean, I got the degree. I mean, it helps me with the academic research, but in one of my jobs, it's useful. My other job, I don't even mention I have a degree, like a doctorate. I mean, education degree, yes, but it's just because it's overqualified. It's ridiculous to have students, like a 5-year-old, call me Dr. Sachs when we're doing piano lessons. It's like, that's a little crazy.
I know. I always joked when I got mine. I was like, I'm going to make my kids call me doctor. I don't. But it would be fun.
They always say that when they know they're in trouble. I'm like,
and I'm guilty of, I put the letters after everything. I will, and I do. And it's funny now, even for this sort of shift in career that I'm taking for the full-time career right now, because here's the other plug for your business. Although I am currently unemployed, I guess I should say, or not full-time employed, I am employed, but is don't necessarily jump away from the 9 to 5 right away. But I've run into that where I started having those conversations with people about shifting from working in higher education to moving into learning and development and human resources. And one of the first conversations I had with someone, they looked at my LinkedIn profile, my resume, and they said, "Oh, okay, I see that you put your the letters MA after your name." And I'm like, "Yeah, I earned those." And so, and then it's, well, I don't know, because somebody may look at this and think that you're going to come in and want like $100,000 a year. And I'm like, I'm applying for entry-level positions. Why would they think that? I don't expect, yes, eventually that'd be nice. But I'm not expecting to be offered $100,000 a year for an entry-level position. And so even that conversation there, and that again goes into sort of the myth that Brittany, you were talking about, that like the higher degree, that people seem to think that these professors are making all this money, that somebody from higher ed, is making all this money. And I'm like, no, in student affairs, those jobs that are entry level, all of them say you have to have a master's. So coming out of this and now having to shift that mindset a little bit. And that's, part of sort of throughout this process, part of my guiding principles that I've kind of developed is like, having that mindset, and that mindset is everything, and being open to those changes. And it's a little difficult because that master's degree, especially struggling through grad school, it's kind of become part of my identity. And so being able to shift and sort of say, okay, I'm Melissa O'Brien, I don't need the letters after my name kind of thing. It's tough. And it maybe shouldn't feel so tough, but it does, because it has become my identity. I've kind of internalized that. And even I remember when I was laid off from that job early on, I moved back to Mississippi, where my husband was still in his graduate program. And I remember being almost at tears filling out an application to work in a restaurant, because I'm sitting there going like, well, what references am I going to put down? I haven't talked to somebody I'd worked at in a restaurant with in like years now, and I'm quickly pulling out my phone and on Facebook Messenger, like tracking people down, be like, hey, can I use a reference since I worked at a restaurant with you before? And I appreciate that I was, given that opportunity to work there, but I was terrified because I knew that like going for a job just to be a waitress when I was laid off and needed the money, putting down, hey, I have a master's degree, might, lead somebody to turn me away.
Yeah, they definitely turned me away when I was getting mine. And so it's this idea of you have to look at what career you really want kind of in the end. And I know that's hard to do, especially when you don't know exactly what you want to do, but start looking at like job ads and just see, hey, this is the ballpark of what I'm looking at. Well, what do those require? Do they require the master's? Do they require a PhD? Because if they don't, then why are you going to spend all this money getting it to not when you don't need it and you could just go straight there right now?
And online courses, that has done wonders as far as making education accessible. Now, I'm not necessarily saying getting that degree through it, but sites like Udemy and Coursera and Lynda, which has now kind of merged with LinkedIn, they have the LinkedIn Learning. Those courses are extremely helpful. So if you're looking at a job ad for a job that you want and you see a list of those skills, skills-based hiring is really what they're going for. That degree says that you could stick with something for a number of years, but they want to know that you have those skills. So, taking those courses, you might be able to just do that if it's something, if you're already kind of have your foot in the door and you're just looking to add some of those skills for that next job, and maybe graduate school isn't the right option for you, then maybe it's just sitting down on one of those sites and taking a few of those courses and finding ways to apply those new skills where you currently are. And we talked about before, finding all those little connections to career paths that don't seem connected. I can guarantee you will find ways, like once the wheels start turning, you'll find ways to start doing that.
Once you start making the connections. I have that problem with undergraduate students all the time because they lack a lot of confidence in skills and things because, most of their jobs are service industry, restaurants, Starbucks, things like that. And they don't know how they can apply, especially, to psychology. They're like, well, how am I going to be a counselor? And I'm like, well, you worked at Starbucks. You had to interact with a lot of people and you had to calm people down. I'm sure you've had to, walk people through things. You've had conversations with people. You have observed people in a way no other human really gets to do, right? So even your job at Starbucks is beneficial. You have certain skills that you're not realizing or transferring. And so helping people make those connections between skills you learn, even in a job that you think might be irrelevant or, lower than what you're anticipating, is just not true. Mm-hmm. There's connections between all of them, and there's skills in every job that you're taking, even if it's not related to the career you want. Somehow there's going to be something in there that you've learned that you can carry with you that maybe somebody else who didn't have that job or that experience can't carry with them and doesn't have, but is drastically needed.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I know we're over time, and so I love this conversation. I could talk to you guys forever, but I don't want to keep you here forever. So thanks for being on the podcast. Do you want to tell people how to get to Flourishing Professional?
Sure. You can find us on our website at flourishingprofessional.com. You can also email us at info@flourishingprofessional.com. That's an email that both Holly and I check. And we are on Facebook and LinkedIn and Pinterest.
Awesome. And we, as always, will link everything in our social media posts, so you'll be able to connect with them.
All right.
So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you for listening to the Career Journey Podcast. Head over to our website at careerjourneypodcast.com for more information and the latest episodes. See you next time.